Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are opening a really complex file. We're examining the surprisingly fragile nature of extreme wealth. And for you, our listener, we're going to try and connect the dots between, global finance, political leverage, and this core truth that when you operate on a world stage, your assets, your status, it's almost always conditional.
That's right. And the central figure in this deep dive is Prince Alwaleed bin Talal. Now, he spent decades, literally decades, carefully cultivating this image. He wanted to be seen as the rational, highly successful Saudi Warren Buffett. He built his investment firm, Kingdom Holding, into this global player.
Right, with huge stakes in really iconic Western companies. You mentioned Citicorp, Apple, Four Seasons Hotels, the kind of stuff that made him a fixture on the global business circuit.
Exactly. But this story isn't just about his impressive portfolio,
Oh.
It's really about the brutal lesson he learned,
Yeah.
which is that financial prestige, global connections, they often mean very little when you're confronted by absolute political power.
And that distinction, that difference between the perceived financial power and, well, actual political safety, that seems to be the key takeaway from the sources we're looking at. Al-Walid was the symbol, wasn't he, of Saudi Arabia integrating into global capitalism, a system supposedly built on contracts, shareholder rights.
Supposedly. But the sources show that even when he was at the peak of his influence, his power was, let's say, viewed skeptically by those who really controlled the political narratives, particularly in the West.
Okay, so how do we see that skepticism in action?
Well, to really illustrate that friction, we have to start with one single but incredibly potent factual connection that comes up. It turns out Prince Alwaleed bin Talal was News Corp's second largest voting shareholder.
Wow, second largest.
Second only to Rupert Murdoch himself.
Yeah.
Just pause and think about that level of influence over global media outlets, the Wall Street Journal, Fox News, the whole empire.
That's a profound state. It really is. Yet, the sources give us this anecdote, this story, that reveals how even that enormous financial investment could be instantly undermined by, well, ideology, politics. We need to really zero in on this friction involving Roger Ailes, who was heading Fox News at the time.
Yeah, it's a moment that just perfectly captures this kind of ideological collision, maybe East versus West, or perhaps just different power centers. So Murdoch, understandably trying to manage his relationship with a key global investor, asks Ailes to meet with the prince.
Oh, okay. Seems reasonable.
But Ailes flatly refused,
Yeah.
just said no. And when his team asked why, a senior producer later recounted Ailes' explanation. He apparently told his internal team he wouldn't meet the prince because, in his view, the prince fundamentally didn't grasp what Ailes saw as the two biggest geopolitical threats at the time.
Which were...
The threat of China and the threat about the Middle East. That was Ailes' stated reason.
Wow. Just think about the audacity of that. A top American media executive refusing a meeting with the second largest voting shareholder. I mean, a guy whose capital is literally underpinning the company he runs, all based on a political judgment about the prince's worldview.
Exactly. It shows that even massive financial power expressed through a significant voting stake can be immediately, subjugated. It runs up against these political and ideological gatekeepers in the West.
And that skepticism, maybe even suspicion from someone like Ailes, it sort of proved prophetic in a way, didn't it? Though the ultimate threat to Al-Walid came from a different direction.
It did. It wasn't international politics that got him in the end. It was domestic. Which brings us to that pivotal moment in November 2017. Al-Waleed's carefully constructed image, this persona of international financial infallibility, it just came crashing down.
Right. This was the so-called anti-corruption purge, spearheaded by Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, MBS.
That's the one. Al-Waleed was arrested, detained for nearly 3 months. And where? In the Riyadh Ritz-Carlton Hotel, alongside hundreds of other prominent Saudis.
Yeah, the irony of being imprisoned in a luxury hotel wasn't lost on anyone. But the sources emphasize the mechanism here, right? This wasn't really about corruption charges in the usual sense.
Not primarily, no. It looked much more like a political maneuver, designed for power consolidation under MBS. His imprisonment really signaled the end of an era, the old way of doing business in Saudi Arabia, where different princes had their own fiefdoms.
So the globe-trotting financier, the Saudi Warren Buffett, is suddenly physically contained, his freedom gone.
Contained in a luxury hotel, yes, but contained nonetheless. And his release wasn't automatic. It was conditional. He had to negotiate a settlement. It was kept secret. But we can absolutely assume it was incredibly expensive financially.
The exact details are opaque, as you say, but the outcome was pretty clear.
Transparently clear. His global financial prestige, his carefully diversified portfolio, all those connections in London and New York, None of it could shield him from the sovereign will of the crown prince. The wealth wasn't a shield at all. It actually became a bargaining chip. He had to pay a steep price. Reports suggest transferring significant holdings, maybe billions, to the state just to get his freedom back.
That is the ultimate demonstration of conditional power, isn't it? Non-negotiable. Your money doesn't matter when the state decides it wants it or wants you contained.
Precisely.
So the Alwaleed saga is this shocking, very modern example, but the sources really compel us to step back a bit. Is this conditional nature of wealth, this vulnerability, unique to absolute monarchies like Saudi Arabia?
That's a great question.
Or is it maybe a structural risk that's inherent whenever you have such extreme concentration of capital, regardless of the political system?
I think to answer that, we really need to look at the history, the deep history of capital accumulation. Because the sheer concentration of wealth, the kind that creates these immense power centers, it's a pattern. It's endured for centuries, actually. When we look at the historical data, particularly Thomas Piketty's work, the numbers are frankly staggering. They show that this kind of concentration is historically the norm, not some kind of exception.
Okay, so let's paint that historical picture. What did concentration look like before, say, the modern financial era we live in now? Let's use 19th century Britain as a baseline, maybe.
Good baseline. If you analyze Britain's wealth distribution, let's say from 1810 through to 1870, the top decile, that's the wealthiest 10% of the population, they consistently controlled about 85% of the total national wealth.
85% for just the top 10th.
85%. Just wrap your head around that. 9 out of every 10 pounds essentially belonged to 1 out of every 10 people. And it didn't stop there. The concentration actually got tighter. By the turn of the century, 1900, 1910, that share belonging to the top 10% went past 90%.
Incredible. And it wasn't just the top 10% overall, was it? The concentration within that elite group was also getting more intense. What about the very, very top, the top 1%?
That's where the power really coalesced. The uppermost centile, the top 1%. Their share rose from maybe 55–60% around the mid-19th century, climbing steadily to nearly 70% between 1910 and 1920.
So just 1% of the population owned roughly 2/3 of everything.
Pretty much 2/3 of the entire nation's capital. It just demonstrates this entrenched structural reality. Extreme concentration seems almost baked into the historical trajectory of capitalist economies.
But what has changed significantly, the sources suggest, isn't necessarily the percentage of concentration, but the form of that wealth, right? The type of asset that actually confers this extreme power has shifted.
Precisely. And that's the critical bridge between, say, the landed gentry of the 19th century and the global financiers like Alwaleed in the 21st. Back in the 18th century, capital was largely tangible stuff, land, real estate, agricultural assets, things you could physically point to.
Right.
Fast forward to today, and that's shifted radically. Now it's industrial capital, and even more importantly for figures like Alwaleed or Buffett, it's highly liquid financial capital, stocks, bonds, derivatives. This liquidity allows wealth to be globalized instantly, giving it this appearance of freedom, of being untethered. But it also makes it incredibly vulnerable to market shocks, sure, but also, as Alwaleed found out, vulnerable to political capture.
That sets up a really crucial contrast then, because the prince was marketed himself as the Saudi Warren Buffett. That implies a certain approach, measured, rational, transparent financial strategy. But even the real Warren Buffett success isn't just about picking stocks, is it? It relies on a highly sophisticated, maybe less obvious financial architecture that gives him immense leverage.
Absolutely. The public perception of Buffett is often just the folksy sage from Omaha picking winning stocks. But the reality, the genius, is arguably more in his corporate architecture. Take the example of Berkshire Hathaway, BRK. There was a time Buffett believed BRK stock was trading way below its intrinsic value. So what did he do? He announced publicly that he would entertain offers to buy back Berkshire's own stock.
Okay.
Now, that move was just a pure signal, a signal of centralized trust and his own belief in the company's value. And the market understood the strength of that signal so instantly that BRK's stock price jumped 24% before he even had a chance to buy back a single share.
Wow. So the mere announcement moved the market that much.
That's the power of a modern financial elite. You can move markets simply by declaring your intent because your credibility and perceived insight are that high.
And the engine behind that power, the true source of his leverage that fuels these investment decisions, the sources call it float. We should probably clarify exactly what float is and how Buffett's architecture really maximizes it.
Yeah, float is key. It's essentially interest-free money. And it's generated primarily by his insurance businesses, like National Indemnity. Think about it.
Right?
When you buy an insurance policy, you pay your premium up front, right?
Right.
The insurance company holds on to that premium that's the float until maybe years or even decades later, a claim is eventually paid out. Because Buffett is an exceptionally good underwriter, meaning his companies calculate risk well, they consistently generate huge amounts of this float. It provides this enormous pool of zero-cost liquidity that he can then invest for Berkshire's benefit, potentially for decades, before the actual claim ever comes due.
Okay. And that's where the specific corporate structure becomes crucial. Can you walk us through how the different parts of his empire work together to really leverage that cash flow?
Certainly. Buffett maximized this advantage by very strategically setting up subsidiaries within the Berkshire structure. He used the float, generated by National Indemnity, for instance, to create other entities like the Reinsurance Court of Nebraska.
Yeah.
This was nested within the larger structure of Diversified, which itself is a key part of the overall Berkshire Hathaway enterprise.
So layers within layers.
Exactly. And Diversified was then able to gain millions upon millions more dollars to invest, all ultimately built on this foundation of zero-cost capital from the insurance float. This architecture, it demonstrates that his elite status relies not just on market insight, but on structuring companies brilliantly to legally and efficiently harvest the leverage provided by the stability of the U.S. regulatory and financial system.
Which brings us back to the conditional point.
Right. If the rules of that U.S. system were suddenly conditional, if they could be arbitrarily changed or ignored like they arguably are in an absolute monarchy or a state undergoing massive political upheaval, that whole beautiful structure, that float engine, would instantly crumble.
That's a really powerful point. When that stable regulatory framework disappears or gets manipulated by absolute power, financial genius, complex architecture, it just becomes irrelevant. The Prince Alwaleed detention showed us the mechanism of outright appropriation via sovereign force. But we see similar dynamics, maybe more complex sometimes, play out in other systems like post-Soviet Russia.
Oh, Russia is a absolutely fascinating and often brutal case study in power, just unilaterally overriding contract law. The lesson there is that sovereign risk, the risk from the state or those controlling it, doesn't always look like a physical arrest. Sometimes it's just a stroke of a pen that effectively legalizes financial theft. The Citicorp share dilution incident is a textbook example of exactly this mechanism.
Okay, walk us through how that dilution actually worked, because it sounds like a perfect illustration of how power can use the tools of corporate law itself to basically screw over minority shareholders.
It was elegant in its brutality, you could say. Bill Browder's fund, Hermitage Capital, was a significant Western investor, a partner in Citicorp, which was a major Russian oil company at the time. The Russian oligarchs, effectively in control, led by Vladimir Putin, decided they wanted to strip the value away from their Western minority partners. Their maneuver was, on the surface, simple corporate finance, but devastating in effect. They drastically increased the total number of shares in Citicorp, nearly tripling the outstanding stock overnight through a massive new share issuance.
Okay, issuing new shares isn't necessarily illegal. How did they specifically exclude the Western partners?
That was the key. They executed this massive share sale, structured potentially as a private placement or maybe a rights issue under the specific Russian corporate laws of the time. They offer these millions of new shares at a ridiculously low price, something like 95% below the current market price. But crucially, they structured the offering in such a way that Browder's fund, the foreign partner, was specifically excluded from participating, from buying any of these cheap new shares.
So the insiders get massively discounted shares, the total number of shares explodes, and the outside partner's ownership percentage just plummets.
Instantly. Their stake in the company shrunk dramatically overnight, without them selling a single share, and without the underlying value of the oil company itself necessarily changing that day.
What was the damage?
Browder calculated that this single, technically legal maneuver slashed his fund's ownership stake from about 2.4% down to a mere 0.9%. Gone. He figured it stripped something like $87 million of value from his clients, not because the market crashed, not because the oil company failed, but purely through legal manipulation enabled by the oligarchic control structure. The financial contract was sort of respected on paper, new shares were issued, but the whole spirit of shareholder rights, of partnership, was completely trampled by the raw power structure.
That's a stark difference from just, say, the state nationalizing an asset. But that kind of more direct, brazen political consolidation also happened in Russia, right? Especially on a massive scale under Putin later on.
It absolutely did. That provides a different model of sovereign risk. Not subtle dilution, but outright political repossession of assets. Think about Gazprom, the massive state natural gas giant. In 2001, Shortly after coming to power, Putin appointed Alexei Miller to lead Gazprom. And Miller wasn't just given a CEO job, he was given, according to sources, an absolute mandate for change.
An absolute mandate. That sounds ominous.
It basically meant consolidate state control over the country's economic crown jewel, reassert the state's authority, and the result was exactly that. The state effectively repossessed huge chunks of Gazprom shares that had ended up in the hands of senior executives and connected insiders during the chaotic privatization schemes of the 1990s.
So this wasn't dilution like Sudanko. This was the state explicitly saying, this asset belongs to the state fundamentally, and we are taking formal control back.
Precisely. Whether it happens through technically legal but manipulative corporate actions like the Sudanko dilution, or through a direct state mandate like with Gazprom reclaiming shares, the underlying message for investors, especially foreign ones, is identical. Your capital, your ownership, your contracts are ultimately conditional. They exist only as long as the sovereign political power tolerates them.
Okay, so let's bring this idea of conditional power back home, maybe, to Western democracies. Here, generally, the state doesn't just seize assets or blatantly override contracts in the same way, but immense wealth can buy the ability to sculpt the ideological landscape, to shape the laws and regulations themselves over the long term. This seems to be the territory of figures like the Koch brothers.
Exactly. They represent a different strategy, perhaps more patient, more systemic. It's the sophisticated deployment of capital, not for immediate extraction, but for long-term political patronage and shaping the entire ideological environment. They didn't need to seize assets directly because their goal was much bigger. To secure a political and regulatory environment where their existing and future capital would be perpetually safe, ideally with regulatory barriers systematically dismantled, they built what became famously known as the coctopus.
The coctopus, yeah, that metaphor suggests something huge, with tentacles reaching everywhere. What were the actual components of that machine, and what was its stated goal, according to the sources?
The coctopus refers to this incredibly extensive, complex network of conservative and libertarian think tanks, academic programs, lobbying organizations, grassroots advocacy groups, legal centers. It's vast. You can think of it as a vertically integrated ideological machine designed to influence public policy and opinion at every level, from local school boards right up to Supreme Court nominations. And the stated goal, according to the sources analyzing their efforts, was incredibly ambitious, almost revolutionary. They aimed to systematically undo the legacies of the New Deal and the Progressive Era, which they fundamentally viewed as the source of excessive government intervention and regulation in the economy.
Okay, but let's talk scale. How does this kind of spending compare financially to the sums involved with someone like Prince Alwaleed or the Russian oligarchs controlling national resources? Is it really comparable in terms of exerting conditional control?
I think it is comparable, yes, because of the sheer scale and the explicit intent. It's not direct asset seizure, obviously, but it is the strategic, massive spending of vast sums specifically to condition the environment in which their assets exist and operate.
Yeah.
The financial commitment is enormous. We have reports, for example, of Charles and David Koch personally pledging something like $12 million at just one single donor meeting they convened.
$12 million at one meeting.
And that personal pledge was just part of a much broader political fundraising effort. In one midterm election cycle alone, Republican-aligned independent groups, heavily funded by the Koch network and similar donors, reportedly pledged a massive total of $200 million for expenditures. Now, that is capital being deployed structurally, systematically, to try and ensure that the rules of the game tax law, environmental regulations, labor laws are perpetually written or rewritten in their favor. It's about making their financial security conditional on the long-term success of their political and ideological machine. It ensures, or aims to ensure, that their wealth remains relatively free from the perceived threat of increased taxation or regulation from a government they see as overreaching.
So whether the capital is being deployed in Riyadh through royal connections, or in Moscow through state control, or in Washington through this kind of ideological network building, control over public perception, over the narrative, seems absolutely essential. It's a weapon, especially for figures like Prince Alwaleed, whose carefully crafted image as the rational Saudi Warren Buffett was so central to his entire brand and global standing.
Absolutely. Maintaining a favorable public image isn't just vanity, it's crucial strategic positioning. Because political enemies, corporate rivals, even internal family rivals, they know exactly how to weaponize negative perception. If we return to that News Corps context for a moment, look at William Randolph Hearst. He understood this perfectly from the other side as he tried to transition from being a powerful newspaper baron into a political candidate himself.
Right. And the sources detail this absolutely ferocious political attack he faced when he ran for governor of New York in 1906. His opponents didn't just critique his policies, they went straight for his image, his philosophy.
They did. His opponents, heavily backed by the powerful Tammany Hall political machine, waged what was essentially a brutal smear campaign. The language they used was deliberately inflammatory, calculated to paint him as a dangerous threat to the established social order. They publicly branded him things like an apostle of riot, an advocate of disorder, and, ironically, given his immense wealth, even a promoter of socialism. The goal was clear. Paint him as a dangerous radical, completely unfit for public office.
And that kind of attack, that narrative assault, it was effective enough to really damage his political credibility long term, wasn't it?
Precisely. The attacks landed, they stuck. The sources note that the New York Times later reported the chairman of the Democratic State Campaign Committee basically issued a political obituary for Hearst's ambitions. He declared that Hearst's usefulness to any political party was effectively a thing of the past. It just underscores that in the intertwined worlds of media and politics, image, perception, narrative, it's often more tangible, more powerful than mere capital. If your opponents can successfully control the story about who you are, they can seriously compromise both your financial and your political power.
We see a similar, maybe even more intensely controlling internal culture created by another major media mogul from that era, Robert Maxwell. He seemed to merge his political profile and his corporate image absolutely ruthlessly.
Well, Maxwell. He created an environment within his media empire, particularly at the Mirror newspaper group, that his own employees reportedly referred to as Lex Maxwelliana.
The law of Maxwell.
The law of Maxwell. It signified a culture of total, unquestioning personal subordination to him. One employee apparently summarized the atmosphere perfectly. When Maxwell shouts, "Jump," my only response is, "How high?" That is absolute conditional power exerted internally over his employees, over his entire corporate direction.
And he wasn't shy about using his public platform, even in his role as a member of parliament, a socialist MP, no less to blatantly promote his own commercial interests, right? Further blurring the lines between his personal power and his corporate value.
He was quite unusual in that respect, yeah. He'd use press conferences, platforms often intended for a political commentary or parliamentary business, to shamelessly promote his private business activities. There's an example cited where he used the media spotlight to announce this sprawling 50,000-mile world tour he was undertaking, the sole purpose to boost the international sales of a new edition of the Chambers Encyclopedia, which his company published. His entire public persona became essentially a corporate tool. It was designed to drive value for his companies and maintain this aura of his absolute, unshakable control, which was absolutely vital for his highly leveraged, often precarious business empire.
Okay, so we have figures like Hearst and Maxwell using media power and image aggressively. But then you have the idealized Buffett persona, suggesting careful, long-term value creation. Yet when we look at certain Asian tycoons mentioned in the sources, we see a different model again, where a carefully cultivated positive public image is allegedly used specifically to enable what looks like pretty cynical shareholder exploitation.
This is a really critical distinction, and it kind of undermines that neat myth of purely rational, globally consistent capitalism. There's a quote from a former Morgan Stanley executive discussing the practices of the Hong Kong tycoon Li Ka-shing. He described Li's strategy quite bluntly as a totally cynical exploitation of a public that adores him but doesn't know better. The adoration, the public trust built up over decades, effectively served as a protective shield, allowing for financial practices that might have drawn much harsher scrutiny otherwise.
And these practices weren't subtle, were they? The sources point to examples involving outright shareholder dilution, maneuvers that really devastated minority investors who bought into the hype. We should probably detail the specifics of how this mechanism operated in some of his corporate spinoffs.
Yeah, the examples are quite stark. Take the case of Vanda Systems, which was a spinoff from Li Ka-shing's main conglomerate, Hutchison. According to the source, the company's stock flew briefly and crashed before being taken back into private ownership for half the listing price.
So pump it up, let the public buy in high, let it collapse, then buy it back cheap.
That's the pattern described. Public investors buy high based on the name and the hype, The company underperforms or collapses, and then it's taken back into private hands by the controlling family or entity at a fraction of the listing price. The insiders potentially profit hugely, while the public shareholders are left holding the bag.
And his son, Richard Lay, executed a similar, perhaps even more dramatic financial extraction with PCCW, the telecommunications company he formed. What was the fallout from that massive takeover of Hong Kong Telecom?
The fallout for outside investors who bought into Richard Lee's vision for PCCW after the Hong Kong Telecom takeover was, well, devastating. The sources state that PCCW's share price experienced a staggering 97% peak-to-trough drop. 97%. That's a virtual wipeout of public capital invested in the company. Now, the key insight here isn't just that this happened, but that this level of financial value extraction appeared to be legally permissible, or at least tolerated, within that specific market structure and corporate governance environment. It allowed the dynastic elite, allegedly, to repeatedly enrich themselves using public capital markets, all while maintaining this public image of brilliant business mastery. It just highlights again that the financial contract, the shareholder agreement, is often conditional on who ultimately holds the real power and controls the corporate levers.
That focus on ultimate control brings us neatly to internal conflicts. Because the power struggles that make capital conditional aren't always external forces like a sovereign purge or a hostile political campaign. Sometimes the most corrosive forms of conditional power operate inside the corporation itself, especially within these giant founder-led or dynastic empires, where family status, personal relationships, and raw power can completely override market logic or standard governance.
Oh, absolutely. The battle for control over the Redstone Empire, Viacom, and CBS is a fascinating, very messy, very modern case of exactly this kind of internal war. The conflict really exploded around Sumner Redstone's declining mental capacity and the huge financial gifts he was making, allegedly under undue influence directly from company funds. And his daughter, Shari Redstone, found herself standing essentially alone initially, demanding proper corporate governance.
What specifically was Shari fighting for in that instance? What governance rules were being bent or broken by her father's actions, according to her?
The core fight, initially, centered on Sumner's alleged use of National Amusements, which is the Redstone family's private holding company that controls Viacom and CBS as his personal piggy bank. When the specific issue of his large personal gifts to companions came up for a vote at a National Amusements board meeting, Shuri was the lone dissenter in a 4-to-1 vote approving them. Her argument was basic corporate hygiene. She insisted that if the company, National Amusements, was paying for these multi-million-dollar gifts, then they absolutely must be recorded accurately in the company's name and books, not disguised somehow as purely personal gifts from her father using his own money. She was fighting for fundamental fiduciary duty, for transparency, and against the dangerous blurring of lines between the family's personal finances and the assets of the corporate entity that ultimately controlled public companies.
And that single act of dissent, standing against her father and his allies on the board, that was crucial, wasn't it? It signaled she was willing to challenge the founder's absolute power, and it eventually helped pave the way for her to gain greater control over the whole empire, right?
Absolutely. Her lone dissent was a very calculated, very public move. It demonstrated her commitment to corporate governance principles over perhaps blind dynastic loyalty or obligation at that moment. That action, combined with the subsequent, very public legal battles over Sumner's mental competency, fundamentally undermined the absolute control that the aging patriarch had wielded over the complex Viacom-CBS structure for decades. It shows that even within the highest echelons of U.S. corporate power, wealth and control can still be conditional on maintaining at least a facade of proper governance. And a determined family member, if they have the standing and the nerve, can weaponize those very rules of governance against the person at the top.
We see a similar, though maybe more operatic and Italian, demonstration of weaponized family conflict in the story of the Gucci dynasty, where internal power struggles escalated into what was essentially a full-fledged legal coup using personal vulnerabilities.
Oh, the Gucci saga is pure drama, but it perfectly illustrates how dynastic conflicts often escalate by utilizing the most damaging personal and legal ammunition available. Maurizio Gucci, who was attempting to consolidate his own power within the family firm, found himself forced into this desperate negotiation after his own relatives, specifically his uncle Aldo and Aldo's sons, turned over a detailed dossier about him to the Italian authorities back in 1985.
And this dossier wasn't about business strategy disagreements, was it? It was about alleged financial crime tied directly to inheritance.
Exactly. It wasn't a boardroom dispute about the direction of the brand. The core allegation in the dossier they handed over was explosive. that Mauricio had allegedly forged his recently deceased father's signature on crucial share certificates. Why? To supposedly avoid paying hefty Italian inheritance taxes. This wasn't just a standard corporate disagreement. This was the calculated weaponization of serious allegations tax evasion. Forgery aimed squarely at undermining the legitimacy of Maurizio's inherited 50% stake in the entire company. It shows that within dynastic wealth structures, personal grudges, historical grievances, and legal vulnerabilities become potent tools used to achieve corporate and financial control. It proves again that family status, inheritance, ownership is always potentially subject to the most ruthless internal power plays.
So ultimately, whether you're fighting off external forces like sovereign powers or internal rivals like family members, the ability to carefully control your public narrative, your image, becomes perhaps the final, crucial corporate tool. This seems to be the lesson we can draw from Oprah Winfrey's incredible rise to billionaire status and how she managed her image.
Oprah's story is a masterclass, really, in illustrating how a meticulously constructed, highly controlled public profile is absolutely essential to building, maintaining, and protecting conditional wealth, especially wealth tied so closely to personality. Remember, she faced deep humiliation early in her career when her own sister sold damaging stories about her difficult childhood to the tabloids. After that experience, Oprah executed this massive strategic shift towards controlling her own narrative with almost surgical precision.
She famously used ironclad confidentiality agreements, didn't she? Essentially making her personal history, her past vulnerabilities, a legal liability for anyone who might try to exploit them commercially.
Exactly. She understood instinctively, or learned the hard way, that her immense fame and the subsequent billion-dollar wealth generated by her media and enterprises were inextricably linked to her carefully crafted public persona. A persona that had to appear simultaneously relatable and open, yet also completely invulnerable to unauthorized exposure. As open and sharing as she appeared on her talk show, the sources suggest she only shared parts of herself in very measured ways. She would dole out small dollops of what she called the bad stuff, but always in settings, like her own show or magazine, that she controlled absolutely, totally. The vast wealth and the corporate valuation of her enterprises became fundamentally dependent on this perfectly curated, legally protected persona. It shows that fame and image are themselves incredibly valuable, but also highly conditional forms of capital that must be proactively, legally, and strategically protected at all costs. The fear of legal reprisal for breaking those confidentiality agreements became her corporate shield.
What a journey. This deep dive, moving from the Saudi prince detained in the Ritz-Carlton to Russian oligarchs legally diluting their Western partners out of existence, from media moguls like Hearst and Maxwell weaponizing image, to dynastic families like the Redstones and Gucci's fighting tooth and nail over control using personal secrets and legal loopholes. It really does bring us back powerfully to our core thesis, doesn't it? That immense wealth, no matter how global or diversified, is always ultimately conditional.
It really is the critical synthesis, I think. Wealth, even enormous wealth, is ultimately a highly effective tool, maybe the most effective in many situations. But it's not the end goal itself, nor is it some kind of magical guaranteed protection. Whether you're facing an absolute political power in a place like Riyadh, or dealing with determined sovereign control asserting itself in Moscow, or even navigating ruthless dynastic adversaries playing hardball in New York or Milan, the very concentration of capital makes it a visible, tempting target. It's always susceptible, always vulnerable to determined political, sovereign, or even dynastic forces who are seeking repossession, dilution, control, or simply leverage.
And the man who is literally branded the Saudi Warren Buffett, Prince Alwaleed bin Talal, he had one of the most visible, globally diversified, seemingly powerful private investment portfolios in the entire world. He hobnobbed with presidents and CEOs. Yet when the chips were truly down in his home country, his vast liquidity, his international connections, even his personal freedom, were all found to be completely conditional on the absolute political will of his crown prince.
And that really is the final provocative thought we should probably leave you, our listener, with. If a figure like Prince Alwaleed, who held such an internationally high-profile, geographically diversified, and financially sophisticated portfolio, still found his immense status and his vast capital completely secondary to absolute political power within his own nation, resulting in his detention, a secret and undoubtedly expensive settlement, and the probable forced transfer of substantial assets back to the state. What does this truly imply about the real level of protection offered by wealth in any system? Even in Western systems, the ones we perceive as having ironclad legal protections for property rights and contracts, how well can wealth really safeguard you when you're faced with truly determined adversaries? Whether those adversaries are corporate raiders cleverly using the letter of the law for dilution, like we saw in some cases, or powerful political actors aiming for ideological capture and regulatory change, like the Koch example suggests, the inherently conditional nature of power in all its forms means that safety, true security, is probably never actually bought outright. It's something that has to be perpetually negotiated, defended, and reasserted, often against forces that care very little for the rules you thought protected you.
A truly sobering analysis of the precariousness that can exist even at the pinnacle of global wealth and influence. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.